Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. So prose is kind of an idea that I like to talk a lot about on this channel. Part of that is because I trained in prose a lot when I was in college and have done a lot of it since then. Part of that is because I think it is one of the most overlooked aspects of writing. And I especially think it's important to look at the junction between the audience understanding of prose and the writer's understanding of prose. I've talked a little bit about that both in my first video on prose and on the one I did earlier this week on archetypes. A lot of writers dislike giving up control of their story to the audience. A really great example of this is Frank Herbert. When he wrote Dune, he created a huge amount of additional vocabulary to describe things that were happening so that he could have absolute control over what characters were saying about the world. That is a very impressive achievement, and I have absolutely no problem with writers who choose to do this. In fact, I think that it's better to do something like that than to use a bunch of imprecise language to try and convey your ideas to the audience. That said, that's not really what I want to talk about today. There's probably a whole nother couple of chats about that, at least, squirreled away in the topic of creating your own language for the purposes of storytelling. But what interests me is talking more about existing stories and specifically adapting them to other media. So right out the way, I want to make clear that I'm not talking about rebooting something. I am not talking about homaging something. And I'm not talking about those rare occasions where two pieces of media wind up being eerily similar to each other because they're playing around with a lot of the same archetypes. We are not talking about John Carter versus Superman. We are talking about the deliberate attempt to adapt one piece of media, be it a novel or a comic book or a radio play, to another piece of media, be it a video game or a movie or a TV show. This attempt at adaptation brings with it a baggage that prose must recognize. And again, this is a thing that exists as much in the minds of the audience as it does in the pen of the writer. You have to recognize the limitations that come with the prose you are working with. If you write Superman, then your audience is going to have a bunch of preconceived notions that word is going to bring with it. You have to be prepared to deal with those notions as a writer, or you are failing in your prose. Now again, because this is a very contentious issue, there's something I have to say right away. The fact that you do not adapt, say, Superman to be perfectly in line with the comics, or even to be the quote-unquote archetypical or iconic Superman, unquote, is not in and of itself a complete failure of your adaptation. There are some people who feel that way. I am not one of them. Prose is just one element of the storytelling. I think it's an important element. I think it is currently an undervalued element, but it's not the only element. So all of my critiques that I'm about to go into here are aimed more at this one narrow section of the prose, and specifically the prose that comes with adapting an existing character. I just want to make that very clear. If you fail at one of these things or all of these things, it doesn't necessarily mean that your entire attempt to adapt a character is crap. It doesn't mean that your story didn't deserve to be told. It doesn't mean any of these things. It just means that maybe you didn't put as much thought into your prose as you could have. That is all I'm trying to say here. And also, another thing that is often brought up in these discussions that I just want to set aside because I'm only looking at the prose. The fact that a movie may or may not have been made without the name of a big title attached to it is not something I'm concerned with here either. For example, the movie Joker has very little to do with the Detective Comics property of Batman. It just doesn't. They recycle some of the names, but mostly it's pretty clear that this was just used as a way for the movie to get its budget. And that's fine. That's sometimes the way the movie making business works. However, just because a film needs to do certain things to get its budget doesn't mean those activities will not affect its prose. Spider-Man 3 had to wedge Venom into its narrative in order to get the sign-off from Sony to get its budget. That didn't mean including Venom made Spider-Man 3 better. It also didn't necessarily have to make it worse. You have to examine the pros in that situation in order to determine whether or not the inclusion of Venom in the story was good or bad for the story. By the same token, when you have to name your story, say, Joker, and tie it into a bunch of Detective Comics properties in order to get it published, the impact of the studio mandate is not then forgiven. If you want to make a story, and the only way you can get that story made is to go to a big name publishing house like Marvel or Warner Brothers, who owns the DC Comics characters, you then need to stop and think about whatever conditions they put on your story and work them into your story organically and in a way in which the prose respects the audience. Otherwise, you have failed your prose to a certain extent. Again, this doesn't sink your movie. I actually don't have a strong opinion on the film Joker. I've never seen it. I haven't watched a lot of mainstream Hollywood in the last 5 or 6 years. Frankly, I don't think they deserve my money. My point is, you can assess these elements of the prose and determine whether they serve well or serve poorly, regardless of what the shenanigans behind the scenes were. So with these disclaimers out of the way, what does it really look like to take this kind of prose seriously? In order to discuss this, I'm just going to briefly discuss 2 different films, and I would strongly encourage you to watch both of them and then read some of the source material and draw some of your own conclusions as well. The first one is the 1978 film Superman, which adapts Superman to the big screen. It's an excellent adaptation of the character, and it succeeds very well in handling the prose of Superman's life. It presents us with a character who's very optimistic. He believes in the potential of humanity. He believes in the importance of using his powers to help other people. We see that he develops these ideals living with his parents in Kansas. We later learn that his father, Jor-El, also believed in these ideals when he discovers his spaceship and builds the Fortress of Solitude. We see him living out these ideals, and we see them contrasted against the character of Lex Luthor, as he typically is in the comics. All of these things respect the core nature of the character, and thus qualify as excellent prose. Now, I'm not going to try and do a full essay breaking down each aspect of this and why they are good. Suffice it to say, if you read some Superman origin stories as they are presented in the comics before the New 52 reboot, and compare them to the 1978 Superman, you will see that these elements are being respected, they are being carefully crafted, even as the filmmakers are working to adapt them to the special effects technology available, to the constraints of movie making at the time period, etc. There is a lot of work and care done into making sure the basic concepts of Superman are translated to the screen. Now, that doesn't make Superman 1978 a flawless film. It just makes it a good adaptation, and it just means the prose in this particular part of the film is good and praiseworthy. There are a number of things that I don't really like about Superman 78, which is fine. There are a number of things I don't like in just about every movie I've seen, with a couple of exceptions. I offer this Superman film as a pretty good adaptation that respects most of the prose around its central character, if not so much around Lex Luthor, although Lex Luthor is more of a chimera in the comics given his long publishing history. The point is, Superman is well adapted in this film. The reason we're looking at Superman here is because it is a good example of good adaptation in prose. There is another good example of adaptation in prose which goes in a completely different direction. That example is Edge of Tomorrow, a Tom Cruise film from 2014. It is, in theory, adapted from the novel All You Need Is Kill by Hiroshi Sakurazaki. The two stories bear very little resemblance to each other at first glance. All You Need Is Kill is a story about the importance of developing resolve and preparing yourself for inevitable death. All of these things lead to cultivating a Bushido mindset in which you are prepared to fight and die for your cause. On the flip side of the coin, Edge of Tomorrow is a story about a coward who must eventually find a reason to awaken courage in himself. He must learn to face death and then put aside his fear of it because there are higher things ahead. These two ideas are thematically somewhat similar. They are about warriors cultivating within themselves the virtues that their culture says are part of how you win wars and, to a lesser extent, come home a glorious victor in battle. But they are written for different cultures, and they have to speak to these different virtues. So they are actually not similar really at all. They present us with two very different starting characters and two very different ending characters who wind up in different places in the story. They have different rewards and they have different final goals. This is really fascinating because Edge of Tomorrow is a really good story. And it's a really good adaptation of All You Need Is Kill for its target audience. And that may seem odd because they have changed so much about it. They have changed so much of the themes. They have changed so much of the characters. Kenji, the protagonist of All You Need Is Kill, is nowhere in William Cage, the protagonist of Edge of Tomorrow. But, the people who wrote the film took all of this into account. They weighed it very carefully. They thought about the virtues that All You Need Is Kill was speaking to, and they very carefully deconstructed the story and reconstructed it around the virtues their audience would understand. And you can see this in all of the decisions made, from very big things like changing the location from Okinawa, which was the setting of the last battle for Japan in World War II, where Japan fought a losing battle which ultimately saw their military forces wiped out, to Normandy, which is not the last battle for American troops in World War II, but is definitely a seminal defining moment at the close of World War II, and which would speak to Americans of ending a conflict in victory, which is something they wanted to point to, as opposed to a Japanese story about coming to grips with death, in which you definitely want to point towards a defeat. And this care is also apparent in the small decisions, where they took Kenji's name and they changed it to Cage, which is actually something the author of the original novel points out as a potential westernization of his name. So they are explicitly saying in this naming convention, yes, we are westernizing this character. We are telling a Western story with some of these broad strokes. We see this care taken in the character of Rita Vrataski. She is the most similar in both film and novel, and yet she emphasizes the different directions of growth for the character. Now, I'm not going to spoil this. The film is less than a decade old, so maybe you haven't seen it. Maybe you didn't even hear of it. It didn't seem to get a whole lot of attention at the time it came out, which was unfortunate because it was a great movie. My point is, by changing the way her relationship with Cage progresses, versus the way her relationship with Kenji progresses, we get, again, that strong sense of a different theme and different morals. And this may not be the best example of the difficulties of adaptation because there wasn't a huge audience for All You Need Is Kill before Edge of Tomorrow came out. I don't know if there was a big one after it came out because, like I said, the movie doesn't seem to have done that well. But there was not as much consciousness of the story in the minds of audiences to provoke a pushback. Nevertheless, in the adaptation, in the way they constructed their prose, the writers of this movie really, really invested time and thought into signposting the changes they were making and why they were making them. And this is true in the final decision they made that, in my opinion, really shows that they were thinking about what they were trying to do here. And that was the changing of the title of the film. Now, not only is All You Need Is Kill a terrible English title for anything, it really doesn't encompass anything of the story they were trying to tell. And the change of that to Edge of Tomorrow shows that this is a forward-thinking film. This is a film about pushing through until you can cross over that boundary into a future you desire, which is what the entire movie is about. You need courage in order to push through these obstacles and get to where you want to go. In contrast, the title All You Need Is Kill is not so much about killing your enemies, but about killing your sense of self, of preparing for death, of embracing that inevitable so that you can develop that Bushido mindset and be ready to go into battle at the drop of a hat. And that is, of course, the core of that novel. So the title was again changed to reflect these thematic elements and to completely disassociate the film from the old property so that people were prepared to take in a completely different story. All of this is great use of prose. And again, you can really drill down into the specifics here and examine how they did it in the minute details as well as the broad ones. That's not my goal today. I just want to encourage people to think very carefully about this kind of prose and observe all the many different ways it can be done well. There's certainly a lot of ways it can be done poorly, and perhaps at some point in the future we'll investigate some of those. But for right now, really digging into those good elements of prose and adaptation is what I want to encourage you to do today. That's all I've got for you today. There is a like button and a subscribe button down below. You can use those as you see fit. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Edge of Tomorrow, and I'll talk to you later.